The Crew Motorfest now has a no collisions modifier in the grand races, and to be honest, I needed to make this video to get my thoughts down on paper so I could decide exactly how I felt about it. But I'm feeling like there's some sort of mistake here. Let's go. Alright, since the Romans, we have been crashing into one another in the grand races. It's particularly bad on the first few corners and usually continues until the pack spreads out over the course of the race. Then the occasional battle between a couple of players will happen in a hairpin and, everywhere else on the course. Because of this, I think some people at IVT recognized that the quality of the experience was being affected by how much or how little you were being contacted by other drivers. So they decided to introduce this modifier that makes all the players ghosted to each other so they can't collide. There's a lot going through my head when I think about how this affects the grand races. High skill players are going to shoot like a rocket ship to the front of the pack and put distance between them and the field way easier. But the first couple of corners are going to be really nice. Passing other players will be so much easier because you don't have to go off your line in order to make that pass. Passes are going to happen without incident, which may yield a more competitive racing environment. Slipstream might be way more OP because it's easier to trade slipstreams. Players without a slipstream might actually be at an even bigger disadvantage. Bumping is part of racing, so does no collisions make this a time trial instead of a race? And what happens after you get back into the lobby with no collisions? And who does this really benefit the most? And lastly, will it stay in the game? And more importantly, are the majority of players going to like it? First, we need to talk about the gap between the high skilled players and the general public. At first, I was really worried that the highly skilled players would find an easier time getting to the front of the pack, and thus the gap would be even bigger and more players would find themselves DNFing the race. However, this hasn't really been the case. Do players still DNF? Of course. But it seems like the track design is helping the general public. Many of the routes are laid out in a way where staying on the road is actually faster than deviating and taking shortcuts, and a lot of the sections involving hairpins don't even have proper gutters, which really takes the guessing game out of the driving. The devs have taken away some of the creative freedoms we used to enjoy and are pointing us in specific directions, which ultimately is closing the gap between sweaty and non-sweaty players. Players who don't know the shortcuts are just going to stick to the road no matter what. But now, with less cuts, the highly skilled players are having to stick to the road as well, which limits any type of advantage they have due to track knowledge. So my initial thought that no collisions might make the gap even bigger is sort of offset by the changes they made with the design of these tracks. Now, to be honest, it's still very early, and the sweats may still find some crazy cuts or develop a better understanding of the fastest lines, and so I still think that gap will widen a little bit, but time will tell. Let's talk about the effect that it had on slipstream and passing. First, passing other players is so much easier. This was to be expected, but it feels even easier than I imagined. This is something that I struggle with a lot as a racer, so it's a much needed change. Secondly, slipstream has changed, and here's what's happening. When you enter another car's space, the slipstream effect is no longer active. There needs to be a minimum distance between you and the car in front of you for it to work properly, and the same goes for drag bump. If you get too close, it doesn't work. This was absolutely by design because in the Crew 2, it was active pretty much all the time no matter where you were, even if you invaded the other player's space. And it really does offset the advantage of not having to struggle to pass people. It limits the advantage of slipstream, which keeps the playing field pretty level for those who have slipstream and those who don't. Those with slipstream obviously have a slight advantage, but it doesn't feel like it's an overpowered advantage that is caused by the no collisions modifier, which is nice. But let's talk about bumping. Not ramming, bumping. Bumping is a part of racing. It's often referred to as trading paint, and it's something that is definitely not universally liked. Some players find it annoying, and some players find it to be an advantage. But with no collisions, it is completely removed from the equation. The intensity of racing is now on the shoulders of how close the drivers are in skill level. The more consistent driver wins the battle nearly every time. No matter how far you quote-unquote stick your elbows out, you cannot defend your position to the high-skilled player. The high-skilled player is going to pass no matter what. And knowing that, I really don't know how I feel about this. I get frustrated when players are super aggressive, which causes me to make a mistake or go off-road, but I hate it when I can't steal a gutter from someone by positioning myself on the inside just before a turn, or take wide angles to make it hard for faster players to pass safely. The reality is, no collision grand racing is a completely different thing. It affects so much of the experience that it really should be considered its own mode. It's really not even grand racing anymore, but from my point of view, it's a nice break from the chaos. I enjoy being able to take the lines that I want without being interrupted and honestly just outright speared in the tighter corners. My results in grand races are so much more consistent overall. I tend to finish in the top 5 more times than not, and that's kind of where I believe my skill level is currently. If I don't, I can easily point to the mistakes that I made during the race as the main reason why I'm not there, and I don't feel as frustrated. Maybe I'm frustrated with myself, but not at some injustice that happened at 2% into the race that caused a huge setback for me, which is generally the case with the collisions on. The bottom line is I feel much more in control of my own destiny within the race. And I can't really speak for all players, but I'm sure the majority of people would agree with that. But because this changes the race so much, I feel like it was a mistake to add it as a modifier. When you go from a no collisions race back to a full collisions race, people continue to drive like there's no collisions, and it's even worse than before. People are so much more reckless, and I find myself not wanting to race in those regular lobbies anymore. When I see that no collisions is active, I jump in and I race. When I don't, I look for something else to do in the game. The issue to me is the back and forth. My gut feeling is that IVT is actually testing this out to see if players like it, but I think it would have been better with all the grand races having no collisions, or at least maybe for this season, or maybe alternating weeks, so that there's a period of time where you have no collisions and then you have a period of time with collisions. That way you don't have to keep adjusting constantly while you're playing. Then once IVT has all of the data, they can go in the direction that the players want. But that to me really is not even the best solution. I think the best solution is to have only the start of the race feature no collisions. It would allow the pack to stretch out a little bit, it would prevent the first corner murders, and it would allow for competitive racing later in the race. It feels like a better best of both worlds situation than having it be on one race and then off another, and then on one race and then off another. So I float this idea out to you guys, the community. How do you feel about no collisions in general? And would you prefer having just the start of the race be ghosted? Let me know in the comments, please. I'm super interested on how you guys are receiving this. I'll be reading through every single one. Thank you guys so much for watching. We'll catch you in the next one. Trigger out.